Last time we fixed up our gameplay a little bit and created an entire level for us to work with, but there's still quite a few little details that need to be fixed up. But before we get to those, let's focus on adding a little bit of UI to our game to make it feel even more like a game. So the first thing I want to do here is actually just organize our content browser because it's getting a little bit messy. We can look in our content browser and see that we have quite a few things here, but it may get a little bit hard to find certain things when we want them. Of course, we could just search for like player and it would come up and we'd have the different things for our player, but I think it's better to just have folders to have things a little bit more organized. So to create a folder, let's just come down to our content browser, right click, and create new folder. We're going to name this one Blueprints. We're going to create another folder here for materials and another folder for levels. So I'm just gonna click and select each of these blueprints here. You can hold control and click on each of them to select each of them individually. And then we're just gonna drag these into our blueprints folder here and select move here. Then I'm gonna select our level and our build data for that level and move it into levels. And then I'm gonna select each of our materials, including the physical material, and move it into our materials folder. Now that looks a lot better. We're now more organized in our content browser, and whenever we wanna look for a blueprint, we can just go into our blueprints folder, and there they all are. Next, in our blueprints folder here, I'm actually going to right click and create a subfolder, and we're going to call this widgets. I'm going to double click, open this up, and we're going to create a widget for our score. So we can right click, go to user interface here at the bottom, and create a widget blueprint. I'm going to name this WBP for widget blueprint underscore score. Now, when we double click and open this up, it's going to bring us an entirely new menu here that we haven't seen yet. And just like our blueprint editor and our level editor and our material editor and all those things, this has its own layout with all of its own little panels all around, including a designer tab and a graph tab. There's a lot going on here, but basically this is Unreal's system for making menus. You can see this little border here. This is our screen. So anything that we put within this screen will be visible. If anything is outside of that rectangle, it will not be displayed. Over here on the left, we have our palette, which has all of the different things we can drag in. So say I wanted to drag in a button, I could just drag this into our little menu here and resize it and do whatever I want with it. There's all kinds of options for color and position and size and things like that. We have our hierarchy over here. So as you saw when I had a button in here, you can see it pop up down here in the hierarchy. We actually have an animation and a timeline tab down here, so we can do different animations for different objects over here. And of course, we have a details panel. And then if we come over here to our graph, you can see it looks a lot like the blueprint editor. We have our My Blueprint tab with functions, macros, variables, and event dispatchers, and then details over here. We come back over here to our designer tab, we're going to create a little widget. And what we're going to do is we're going to drag this little text object over here from palette under common. I'm just going to drop this in near the center. Where we drop this text really doesn't matter because we're going to reposition it over here in the details panel. First thing I want to do is change the anchor to the top center. You can see there's different options here, and we're just going to select the top center. Then we want to change the position relative to this anchor. So if I were to zero this out, so 0 on the X, 0 on the Y, you can see the top left corner of the text block is right at the top center. And you can see if I put this back to top left and I zeroed this out, it would be over there now. So we want this relative to the top center at 0, 0. But we also want to make sure that the alignment on the X is 0.5. So that way it sits exactly in the center of this object. We could also do this on the Y. It really doesn't matter, but I'm going to anyways. Now we don't want it to sit right here because that's only half visible on the screen entirely. So we want to offset the position to something like 200 on the Y. And now also we can change the size of this text block on the X. As it gets smaller, you can see it doesn't really affect anything. And if it gets bigger, it aligns to the left. We could fix this by just coming down here to justification under appearance and font and just set that to centered and problem solved. But I think it's better to just select this little option here under slot to size to content. So that way it'll always be the size of whatever text is within it. So we can change this text to something like 250 by default. And then we're also going to change the font size to something like 100. This is a little bit too bold of a font for me. I think it should be really thin. And we could just come over here and select our typeface from bold to light, and that works, but I feel like we could get even thinner. And we don't have Roboto thin in here. So what we're going to do is we're going to install a font. So I'm going to just compile and save this widget and close it. And under widgets, I'm actually going to create a new folder in here as well called fonts. I'm going to open this up, and I'm actually going to minimize this. And as you can see, I have Roboto, the entire font family, installed on my computer, but you can find this by going to the front page of fonts.google.com, and here we have Roboto. If you open this up, you can see it comes with a bunch of different styles, including thin. So all you need to do is drag this Roboto thin into our project and drop it into the fonts folder. And when it asks you, would you like to create a new font asset using the imported font face as its default font, we're going to select yes to all, and this is going to do everything for us. As you can see, it created two things here, and that's all we need to do. Now, if we save this, come back to our widgets folder and double click this score widget to open it back up, we can select our text here and change the font family to Roboto thin font. And there we go. Now it's thin. Another thing is I think this is definitely too bright. So I think a better color and opacity to use would be some sort of grayish color. I think that'll work. It doesn't look super great in here right now because the background is dark, but once we get in game, that'll look a lot better. So now that that's done, we can compile this and close this widget. Now we need to be able to display it, because if we play right now, nothing happens. We have our widget, but it's not being told to display to the screen. So to do this, let's go into our blueprints folder again, open up our player. We're going to come up to our event begin play that we set up. I'm actually going to add a sequence here just in case we want to do other things later. Off of the then 0 here, we're just going to create a widget by finding the create widget node under user interface. Now this is going to have a few arguments here, the class and the owning player. First of all, the class we need to select as WPP score because that's the one that we just created. And the owning player we actually don't have to define because this is a single player game where there is only one option. But if you wanted to, you could get player controller and plug this into the owning player here, and that will define whichever player index we decide. But remember, we are player 0, so this really doesn't matter. Like I said, this creates the widget. So if we were to just play right now, nothing happens still. The widget's been created, but it isn't being displayed. So if we come back into our player, we can drag off of this return value, and we're going to add to viewport. And you can see it'll automatically connect the execution pin and the return value here. And then we can compile this and save this. And now when we play, it will be displayed to our screen. But the score isn't updating at all. And that's because we didn't tell it to. So let's go ahead and go back to our widgets here, open up our score, and we're actually going to bind this text value here to a function. So we can come over here to text, and on the right we have bind. We're going to create a binding. Now the first thing I want to do is change the name of this. We're going to come up here to the left under functions, and as we can see, get text _ 0. I'm going to change this to update score. Now I'm actually just going to adjust the positioning here, give it a little bit more space. And the way we're going to do this is a way that I wouldn't normally recommend it, but because we find our player here and we select it in the world, its location is 0 on the X. So since we're starting at 0 on the X and we want our player to start with a score of 0, technically we can just set the score relative to the player's position. So to do this, we can simply get the player's location, break the vector, get the X location, and then return it as text. But there's one big problem. We do have the ability to get player controller, get player character, get owning player pawn, there's a bunch of different options we have here, but none of these work because our player, remember, is just an actor. It's not actually of a pawn or character class. So we can delete all of these. So how do we get access to our player? Well, we actually need to create a public variable for this. So we're going to come over here to the left, add a variable. I'm going to call this player. We're going to make it public, but then we're also going to change this type to BP_player. We can select this and we're going to make sure that it is an object reference. And then we're also going to select this little option here, expose on spawn. Now nothing happens in here, but if we close this widget and come back to our player, there's a new argument here called player. This is specifically requesting a player object reference. As you can see here, we are a blueprint player object reference. So we can simply get self, you can get reference to self here, and just plug this into player, and there we go. Now, whenever it asks for player, it will always be referencing this blueprint. We can compile this and close this again, come back to our widget, and now if we come back to our graph here, whenever we use this player variable, it will be referencing that specific player blueprint. So from this, we can get actor location. We can then break that vector to get all 3 float values, and then we can simply take our X and plug it into our return value here, and it'll convert float to text. And now if we compile this and play this right now, you'll see there are quite a few problems. First of all, that number is huge. Second of all, there's a bunch of decimal places. 2 really big problems. So let's go back to our widget here, go back to our graph. We're going to first divide this X value by a float. We're going to divide it by 100. Then we're going to plug this float value into the value here. Click this little drop down here and change our maximum fractional digits here down to 0. 0. So now there will be 0 places after the decimal, which will get rid of the decimal as a whole. So we can compile this, save this, close this once again, and now it will climb a lot slower and there's no decimal places. That looks a lot better. Obviously, it's relative to our player's position, so if we bump into anything and go back, you can see the score goes back as well. Maybe that's what you like. It's okay to me. I think we can do something to change that maybe later, but for now, that's okay. And that's gonna do it for this video. I know it's kind of simplistic, but it gets us started in the right direction because now it looks like we're actually making progress when we play our game and not just kind of moving forward into nothing. We're actually getting a score. In the next video, we'll be tackling the game over system so that we can actually have some sort of way to restart the level when we hit something, because right now we just kind of sit there and we have to manually exit the game and restart to try again. We don't want that to happen. We want to actually create some sort of game over system. Thank you guys for the incredible support you've given me throughout this series, and thank you for your patience as I work to create the final videos in the series, and I hope to see you in the next one.